will want to get to learn about uh, what we're going to discuss, and also learn from the experiences of Ann Vaughan. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. Really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to talk to all of you from all over the world. I appreciate from Nigeria to Nepal and everywhere in between. So thank you for taking the time to be here and chat. I'm looking forward to a good dialogue with you. As you noted, just maybe a bit of background. I currently work for CARE, the International Humanitarian and Development Organization. We work in over 100 countries, including in Nigeria, and have been in Nigeria since 2017. And I think CARE's mission aligns really well with the work that we'll talk about today and the dialogue I hope we could have. Um, CARE works to fight poverty and achieve social justice and really center women and girls in our work because we know we can't overcome poverty until all the people have equal rights and opportunities. Our work in Nigeria has focused on life-saving activities, humanitarian work, defeating poverty, and helping fight for social justice. And I think are really proud to work and partner with other parts of Nigerian civil society to try to to make a world where we can have hope and tolerance. And we've worked since, again, I think I mentioned 2017, and have helped reach over 3 million people and partnered with people in different program areas like justice for women and girls, food systems and livelihoods, and humanitarian preparedness and response. And we have a strong presence through the North, and have done a whole host of projects that also take climate change into consideration too. I think we can get into that a little bit more, and happy to jump into some of those questions if you'd like. But I also wanted to give you some appreciation for the work that you and your colleagues do on solar energy and on water, which is so important. And maybe we can get into a little bit of the work that you also do in this space and learn from each other. So with that, maybe I can turn back to you and we can dive into some questions.
Okay. Thank you so much, Anne. I think we have three uh, main areas that we'll be discussing today. One is resilience reality, like what does food system transformation actually look like on the ground right now? Despite the fact that you said it has done remarkably well before it's let me say before it comes to an end. So what does
Yeah.
food systems transformation actually look like on the ground right now? So,
No, good question. And I think what food systems transformation looks like depends. We would love folks chat points in the chat too, so we can have a nice dialogue on this also. But having a food system that is just allows for all parts of society to be able to have access and affordability to nutritious food is the dream of food system transformation, and that we can do it in a way that also protects the planet so that we can continue to grow nutritious food into the future for our children and our grandchildren and our great grandchildren. Right now, food systems, and I would say there's a lot of good evidence and data out there on how climate change and land degradation is making it a lot harder for soils to be able to produce and the crops to be able to grow um, enough sufficient food for our communities. And even in Nigeria, we've seen high IPC levels, which stands for hunger levels. But around the world, we have over 800 million hungry people who go to bed and have to send their kids to bed hungry every night. And that to me is not the type of food system we want. We want a food system that is able to provide sufficient healthy calories to our families to be able to thrive. And actually the whole reason I got into international work was back when I was 18 or 19, when I was a baby, when I was very young, and saw a paragraph in a psychology textbook that talked about if you don't have sufficient calories the first 1,000 days of your life, you don't you actually it hurts your development so much that it can impact your whole life. So if we don't have enough nutrition for in that first 1,000 days, in the first years of people's lives, you're not able to fulfill all of your potential. And I think that's something worth fighting to fix and address and make sure that our food systems work. So that's a little depressing about, what the problem set is, but I think there's some real energy and how do we get to a food system that's transformed and addressing some of the problems that lead to hunger and malnutrition. So a lot of what that entails is also making sure we're empowering our farmers. There's over 600 million smallholder farmers, so farmers on smaller plots who struggle with having access to the right technologies, the right credit and financing, um, and just the resources to be able to ensure that they can thrive and grow enough food for their families and their communities. I think CARE is been working hard to address some of those food security issues and working and partnering with communities, including women's groups, to make sure that we're able to share and learn some of the best technologies and activities. And that includes learning from each other and other community members to make sure we're sharing some of the best knowledge. So everything from how next to each other, it's a good way to fix nitrogen in soil, or if you have solar powered irrigation, which we'd love to hear from you all, it's an easier way to get water to your crops. So there's a lot of steps that need to happen. What I'm very worried about in making sure our food systems transform is it's getting hotter. That is what climate change is. It's global warming, and it's getting hotter in many parts of the planet. I understand northern Nigeria is going to be hotter than southern Nigeria, and there's lots of good data and information about how climate and then is impacting our ability to grow things. So farmers and food systems and producers and those that buy food from us having the right information about our changing weather patterns that are changing a lot faster than we'd like, how they can plant earlier, diversify their crops more, have more drought tolerant or even flood tolerant, depending on where you live. Seeds and tools is really important so that we can transform this already stressed food system to be more resilient in the face of climate change. And one thing I might focus on a bit, especially because I think you all are doing some really neat work with solar power with solar, is cold storage and food loss and waste. Right now, globally, we lose about 1/3 of all food either on the way to market or, my goodness, people throw food out afterwards. It's 1/3 of all food. If it was a country, the emissions from all that rotting food would be the third largest emitter in the world, which is crazy when you think about it. When we have all these folks that are hungry and need food, and we're losing or wasting 1/3 of all food. There's a really good World Bank report that dives into, in Nigeria specifically, where we lose food, tomatoes and fish, along the different parts of the value chain, and provides recommendations on how we can cut some of those losses, including in a lot of solar areas, or in how we need more cold storage. That can be solar powered cold storage. So there's sort of exciting ways when we get specific about our part of the world and different parts of where we can transform our food systems, looking at the food loss and waste in our sector and figuring out ways to address this, because we can't have we need a food system that does not waste 1/3 of all food before it can help address both hunger and nutrition around the world. So I'd kind of put it out to you all in the universe that in order to have a smart food system and transform a food system, an easy place to start is looking at where we have some of that waste and loss to make sure we can cut that, get food to where it needs to go, and also save all the energy that goes into producing food is not wasted and actually makes it to the people that are willing that need it. So maybe I'll stop there on that question. I feel very passionately about food loss and waste, so I could talk for the whole hour about that. But I think that we could move on if you'd like, or would love to hear if you any of your reflections on how working on cold storage or any of the solar work on food systems has helped energize some of your partners.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm sure many people will have a lot of questions, but before then, let's a bit deep dive on the another topic, which is breaking barriers. So, for example, how do you make climate finance truly inclusive for women and youth, especially looking at funding from global north has been stopped also to some extent, unlike before. And now it's a problem. So how do we make this climate finance truly inclusive, inclusive for women and youth, especially sub-Saharan Africa?
Yeah. I really appreciate this question because it highlights a huge problem is that the vast majority of climate finance does not make it to local levels. There's been studies done that shows that less than 10% of adaptation finance makes it to communities. And I've seen something recently from the World Bank that shows it's about 1% of adaptation climate finance makes it down to local communities. That is not how we help communities adapt to climate change. And let's remember that communities are on the front lines. They are the ones most impacted by the more extreme weather, by the droughts, by the flooding, by extreme heat. It's happening down at where people live, and that's the money is not flowing there as sufficiently or as fast as we need it to really prepare and prevent some of the worst impacts of climate change. So I love this question because if we don't get it right, if we don't get money, especially down to women who are some of the best climate champions out there, and there's been great research that shows how women empowered in climate leadership roles can really make transformational change, and youth are essential and some of the most innovative creators of different types of activities and movements to create change. So how we do this, there's a good set of principles that I'd recommend folks can look at called locally led adaptation principles. And I'm going to talk more about adaptation. We can talk about mitigation and solar and a couple things, but let me start with adaptation. Is that the decision making has to be made as locally as we can because communities on the ground understand what the impacts are. They know, what's happening with their rivers, what's happening when it comes to their crops, and what those different adaptations are. So one of the principles of this locally led adaptation really focuses on decision making being devolved and making sure we're counting and accounting for and providing leadership opportunities for the women and youth that you've just mentioned. CARE, I'm really proud and excited of a lot of the work that CARE's done in locally led adaptation over the years. And one of the things we think is really important is looking at both the climate vulnerabilities and also the capacities, the adaptive capacities of communities. So we work closely and sit down with equal amounts of making sure women are incorporated and youth are incorporated into understanding folks as both the vulnerabilities, but also really importantly, we all have agency, right? Like we can learn and understand more about what the threats are to our communities, but also have the ability to help adapt to those. So I'd recommend if folks are interested in and again, something called the CVCA, it's a climate vulnerability and climate assessment or capacity assessment, excuse me, that digs into how we can really identify at a very low level what the needs are. So if you can then quantify what your needs are, it's easier to talk to policymakers. It's easier to talk to the funds and say, we have seen this much decrease in our water levels, this much our yields are going down, and getting specific about what some of the problems are so you can have sort of informed dialogues with the climate funders. Because one of the things I've learned over the years with climate funders is they are very data. The climate community comes out of a lot of scientists who are doing amazing work, and they really want to be able to quantify down to a half a degree what's happening so that you can respond appropriately. So we, as as organizers and as folks working on supporting communities, need to be able to identify that, and also make sure. And again, the data on this is so important, that how important it is for real change to happen. You need to be inclusive and have at the regional and national level, um, and getting the right data to be able to quantify what needs are can really help make some of the difference in engaging with that climate finance and getting some of that very needed money down to local levels. And there's been some good examples of this. Just to flag from a government level, Kenya has a decentralization program where they flow money through sort of local communities and pushing on getting subnational governments to work well. I know that's a big ask, but that's one way to really push this on the adaptation front. Very briefly on mitigation, there's a lot more money in mitigation. Solar is easier to fund than a lot of adaptation, or has been over the past, than a lot of adaptation, in part because there's a lot of ways to measure a lot of the mitigation activities. So you can quantify it and fund it more. But making sure that some of that climate finance that can help scale solar makes it to local levels is also really important. And the private sector has been playing an increasingly important role in funding these activities. And now, not all are incentivizing missions. It's that data that really helps move some of that money. And I would argue that if we don't include gender disaggregated data by youth and counting, so we can show how much finance reaches it to different levels and to whom in those levels and to who's getting that money, we're not going to have equitable climate finance. So we would really encourage folks to good data keeping, use some of all that new AI technology and such to be able to pull together the information to put together proposals that can push that climate finance and show, hey, here's how we reach a lot of people. Hope that makes sense. I get passionate about how we get money to local levels and get in the weeds a little bit fast, but apologies. So I'll stop there.
Yeah. So I think the difference between funding climate mitigation and adaptation can be looked at through the GCF and adaptation fund.
Yep.
Because the GCF will fund more money compared to adaptation fund. And then now there is this loss and damage. So it's a bit tricky, but again, am I audible?
Oh shoot, I'm losing you a little bit. Repeating the question.
Yeah. Okay. What I was trying to say is, if you look at the GCF, GCF pumps more money compared to adaptation fund. So we can a bit say, okay, the mitigation has more compared to adaptation. Now, how do we bridge that gap? Especially most of this funding stays at the national level. It doesn't get to the
Yep.
local communities where it's needed the most.
I mean, this is a problem. It's a huge problem. There are some efforts to improve it, and the GCF is supposed to provide a lot of adaptation fund too, and is working towards that. They've made some good reforms over the years to try to address this, and also there's a push, my understanding is, from the board members of the GCF to fund more local entities, so entities based in country, not just the banks and the UN has gotten traditionally a lot of money out of the GCF. So there are some good reforms that are underway. It still can take a lot of time and resources to apply for these funds. So working in coalition, and some of the reforms that the GCF specifically have made are looking at, or there's been some good examples. I think there was a good program in Bangladesh that brought together national, like a consortium of groups, and made it easier for local partners to be able to apply for GCF funds or to sub grant, or another way of doing it also. So you can try to come together, but that process can still take a while. The GCF is getting faster. But working in consortium, because it is resource intensive, it takes a lot of time to pull together proposals. Other things to look at are what banks, because the GCF funds a lot of banks that then say we're going to do different programs. So we have a friend from Nepal here. There's a program I was just looking at that the GCF is funding in Asia that gives money to the Asian Development Bank, and then the Asian Development Bank will start implementing. For local organizations, looking at who the GCF is funding in country and talking to those agencies. Local knowledge, we're on the ground, we're doing this work. We've worked with X number of solar, providers and trained this many solar, insert whatever project you're working on, is also one way to try to pull down, because it's how it flows is you're right, it takes a long time to get to local levels, but looking at who the GCF funds within Nigeria or other countries, and engaging with those partners is one way to try to tap into some of that funding. Encouraging governments to continue to push for more adaptation and support for local entities, I think, is also really important. There has been, I used to sit in on a lot of the negotiations on some of this, and there's a really strong push from the African group, the African bloc at the UNFCCC, who had been doing a really good job of pushing to try to push for more adaptation and more local implementation. And I think continuing governments to continue to engage in the UNFCCC in that process, I think, is really helpful. Some of the European donors have been really good about that also. So I think there's hope. Is it going to be as fast as we'd like? No, but I think there's some really, and the new GCF executive director, I think, is really committed to trying to make this work. She's traveled to, oh gosh, South Sudan recently, Chad recently, and she's committed to trying to get more money to places that need it. I think how we from civil society can continue to try to engage and provide that information that we talked about a bit before, about like, what are the needs on the ground? Here's what it's really like on the ground, and here's what we really need, is helpful, and can make for better projects too. I wish I had an easier answer, but I don't. It is a bit of a complicated system, but gosh, I say 50, it's so much better than it was 5 years ago. Got to tell you, there's been some good reforms.
Okay, perfect. So I think let's deep down a bit about policy practice bridge. How can local NGOs like our center and other NGOs around better align with, for example, CARE's vision and also USAID and other global players
Yeah.
on the situation?
I mean, it's a very different world. It's been, what is it? Today's the February 25th. It's been about a year since USAID was pulled down or changed. I mean, so USAID provided a large percentage of financing for climate and international development. So we're in a very different world right now. Other European donors are also pulling back, according to press reports, and there's a lot of global politics that have changed significantly in the last year. So I think as a, a civil society community, we have to get creative on how we can you can unlock different types of financing through in the solar space a lot of interesting um, so I understand there is this push that we're very fast because of climate and we need to respond and build resilience quickly to that. Are what's needed in different ways. And the Green Climate Fund is looking a lot at how do we do that. It's working with and advocating for more in adaptation, more in some of the policies that can make it easier for you to scale the good work that you're doing on solar, and look holistically at the system. There's not. It's a very different world where we don't have really large bilateral donors anymore. But we also know that partnering with the private sector, who are, in communities also, and maybe profit driven, but if they are aligned with the values that your NGO has, can really help move things forward and work together so we can have some sustainable change. We're working and really excited about a partnership with a company that's also aligned with our values to help livestock and farmers. I was just in Laos working on this, who we want to reduce the methane emissions from the cows of farmers, or the company wants to be able to do that and leverage the carbon market. And we want to help improve the productivity of the farmers so they can have more milk and sell their cows for more. So we're working with this neat company that has a technology that also one way to do this. It can take time and money, and there's a really, talk about some of the science that we talked about earlier, that's needed to be pretty technical in this space, but finding partners in this space or getting smart. And how you study up on how the carbon markets work and how to tap into them. They are growing. They can, and making sure that we have high integrity and high standards for care. One of those things is that co-benefits have to go back to the community. We have to make sure women and youth are incorporated into the co-benefits of a carbon project, or we don't think it's doing good and we don't want to work on it. We want to work on projects that help support the communities. And this is a large and growing market, both the voluntary carbon market. And there's been a lot of movement thanks to some work on what's called Article 6.2 on compliance markets around the world. So there's more of a demand for carbon credits. So how can we, as civil society that cares about community impact and climate change, put our expertise and knowledge together to partner with private sector partners maybe that are working in this space too, so we can do good for the planet and also be able to fund and scale projects that can help more people.
Thank you so much for this wonderful analysis. I think the next step is going to be like a town hall. We will have Q&A, so the floor will be open to respective participants. I know you have lots of questions, especially on green financing and also food security, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where there is a lot of crisis, communal crisis, especially as we have seen in the case of Nigeria, Niger, Chad, Mali, and Sahel. So thank you so much. The floor is open. You can put your question in the chat, or you can raise your hand. I will meet you, then you can say 1 or 2 words.
Hi, Anna. Can I have a question? It's just an inquiry, not very a question type.
Sorry,
Yeah.
sir. Can you introduce yourself, name and where you're
Oh, great.
from?
Great. Thank you. I am Purval. I'm from Nepal. I actually work in the intersections of development plus academia, transitioning to we even have a sort of action intervention program mediated by university also. So I work on that frontier. So I'm a hybrid person in terms of work nature. So my inquiry is like we also work on a type of food resilience.
Mhm.
When we are talking about the transformative resilience and the climate change risk, one part is the production side. I agree on that part, what you highlighted, and also you talk a little about the self life. But the other part is about the market, the supply chain, and value additions. And lots of information is lacking. And moreover, that in the South, the infrastructure is the biggest problem, which is
Yeah,
actually we have to input. And that demands a more external resources, external technology in a varieties of form. I think that's something when we have to ensure because people livelihoods and their expectations will swing as they see others, and the food things also comes together in the same way, the changing natures of the food. And then
yeah,
so if they continue with the existing practices, we could readily make food security more better. But when things change and then people habits, food and everything changes, we also need these type of infrastructures to be in place, the market
yeah.
exchange. So how do the development sectors actually work on these? Because you have two obligations. One is access and another is to change these, address the changing needs of these food dynamics,
Yeah.
because people will definitely would like to copy, and even we also would like to see that they have a choices of the nature of the food in order to establish a security. So this is what I feel when I go to the remote areas. I see like there is availability if things are managed, but their aspirations is towards a new type of food. I mean, like for example, let's say some ready noodles,
Yeah.
something bread, something. So I think do we need to work on a people awareness frontiers together and then infrastructure investment equally in a holistic approach in order to make this security when climate change is impacting? How do you see this whole ecosystem?
Oh my goodness, that is a really good and very hard question. One of the neat lessons right at the end of when USAID, my last couple months at USAID, we put out a really neat report on nutrition. And there was a climate angle to it that looked at how time on yields and increasing yields, which is needed, right? But we also have to work on what is the demand for healthy food also, and how do we incentivize that? And one of the ways this gets very, if you're a very good question, but it gets very into the details of how donors hopefully in the future, especially if we keep pushing on the need for nutritious food that is also good for people and planet, can you have as an outcome not just yield, but nutritional outcomes and pushing on the demand and incentivizing demand for good food. Now there's analogies in this report looked at, I'm trying to remember the exact name of it, but it was BIFAD Nutrition Report in 2024, the fall that came out. And it was one of the best sessions I've ever participated in when I was at U. And it really talked about we got to change the demand signals also for the private sector to say, hey, this is healthy. So a lot of that comes down to advocating with governments on what are we going to approve? What are we going to support so that there is a pull for farmers to produce more? The Rockefeller Center is doing really neat things on this, on trying to get schools and governments to make sure that we're procuring food that's grown regeneratively, right? So there's that big demand pull. If you think about how much you grow for feeding government and feeding school feeding programs, can we get the demand pull for regenerative food? So that gets a bit to your question, but I'd add on really strongly that nutritional component too, and that how do you create a market demand? We had anyway, I'll stop there because it's a very good question, but I think a lot of it comes back down to policies even though we know there's so much informal economy when it comes to food systems around the world, but starting with and making sure we're incentivizing the right things is really critical. So good question, and would love for you to keep working on it to
Actually,
solve it.
this is what I am trying to work on a little bit different concept of living lab,
Yeah.
where I would like to take a student and then work in some isolated island village, which practices much of the traditional things. They throw out categorical food.
Yeah.
Like there are some locally grown things. They don't have a market access. I mean, economically non-feasible market. They have to carry all of those things. On the other hand, there is a crisis of main staple food, what they call it. And
Yeah.
it's like you have a production, but you don't have a food. You see,
Yeah.
so that's the
Yeah.
dilemma to work on those areas. And then we were trying to develop certain program with this Fast and Action, and they have given me an assignment in order to develop whole systems. We are intending to integrate schools over there because we see the
Good.
nutrition gap, we see
Yeah.
the health gap, and it's also linked with the food. And their main engagement is farming, so that should be in the center. So we are trying to figure it out, and then I was just trying to know about your experiences around the globe regarding these things.
It is, the market access is really, really important. It is really hard in some rural areas to make that happen. Something that we were doing just to bring it to sub-Saharan Africa is there was a corridor, or still is a corridor called the Lobito Corridor that is opening up parts of northern Zambia, southern DRC, and the opportunities when infrastructure comes in for food security and inputs to come out and farmers to be able to sell at a higher value is really exciting. You also have to worry about the environmental impacts of infrastructure too, because there's lots of interesting studies on how that can, if you're not careful and intentional, you can hurt the land too, which then hurts yields and et cetera and all that. So it's but getting the infrastructure, that's why we lose a lot of fruits and vegetables on the way to market, is the infrastructure isn't they break on the roads. So yeah, it hasn't been done. You've got a big problem to solve. It's not easy.
Yeah. Your idea of linking with international financial institution was one, but like what it had happened in our cases, I don't know what it happens. The international financial institutions like ADB and World Bank, they work more tied with the program rather than projects. And government
Yeah.
sweeps the funding of them and then prioritize other sectors. And when government funds it, they look at the mass population, how much populations that they cater it. And when there are squatters in a very remote hilly patches, it's a really hard soup. And then we have been trying on different frontiers with those small budgets. So anyway, that was good to listen to you, and many of the experiences. Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prabhat. I think we have Ildar from back. So Lisa, you can go ahead.
Thank you. My name is a bit complicated. Ingvar Rönnbäck. I'm coming from Sweden, actually. I was very interested because I worked with partners in Africa, mostly in Kenya, for a number of years, and I'm representing the Swedish Center for Rural Health, because that's very connected to questions of food, of course. I also have other hats, but they are not as important in this case as it is. My question is a bit broad, because when I'm listening to the questions and talks about climate financing and financing, we often talk about food security, but not as much about food sovereignty. I wonder from two participants, are there any voices for sort of a critique of the food security discourse and more leaning towards food sovereignty, where you actually own and mobilizes farmers for common purposes? Because we know there's a critique against the global food system also. They are benefiting a few, and it's hard to get really equity in the system. And that was also highlighted from the gentleman from Nepal who said it's very tough in the rural areas. And since we are working from the Swedish perspective with supporting our partner with getting access to healthcare in the rural areas. We have a special interest in this. I can also just mention to all of you that Sweden, a highly sort of developed, modern, rich country, but we also have managed to trash our food systems in Sweden because we are very dependent of international exports and imports of foods, and not have the farmers have decreased in numbers, and it's almost only the big farmers left, and the small farmers are really took a hard blow from current policies and previous policies and so on. So we are sitting in the same boat, trying to find out how to support a more decentralized and community-owned food system in Sweden as well. So that was just some reflection, and I hope you can say something about it.
Oh my goodness, that's a big question. Before I've only had one cup of coffee, and it is part of the one of the biggest challenges, I think. How do we have an equitable food system is really what we're trying to go for, and and that farmers can receive the value for their food too, which I think also means do we have to pay more for that food and actually pay for what it's worth, or even tie in the environmental needs and such on that. So I'd love to hear other people's reflections on that. And I think a lot comes down to policies and what we incentivize in our food systems too. What we incentivize even when it comes to fertilizer. How do we get the right subsidies to do the right type of interventions that help also make sure that it's long-term and sustainable, and that we can feed a growing population. Like, we also have there's so much hunger still. 800 million people are still going to bed hungry every night. So how do we balance all of these things? And it really is, talk about a big need for transformation. But I think would love to hear from others on this too, with apologies that it's starting. I have speaking of future sustainability, I have a wonderful daughter that's just has woken up. So I apologize if there's any noise in the background on my side.
I can add a little bit what we have been practicing in terms of sovereignty. As I already told, we try to work on patches on the hills. So there are both ways. We are not only the single institution working over there, and sometimes there are seeds imported and there are protocols of cultivations of that's challenging actually the local agroecological practices. So I think it's really challenging on that part. But however, for me and how I am working with one of the communities, we are trying to emphasize on the local agroecological practices, what earlier one of the component of sovereignty. So this is what we have been trying to do, and we have been trying to make it an agroecological system over there. We are patenting the product in the place of names, and then we call it local breeds to the nearest local market. And there is a women group, which we call it in our name, GEMS, Women GEMS, Mahila Ratna, it's called that. So that's a loose group, and they are making those products, they are adding the value. And this is not to the scale, but we got some seed money, and then things are a little bit expanding. Gradually this year, what I found is they were able to add some infrastructure. They were able to add one vehicle to make those supply, but practices are retained. So this was something not in a scale, but some ongoing practices. And as you told it, there are lots of influences coming from the outer system, and they are resisting in a way to that also, because they have hardly created a demand in a market of local foods. And at the same time, when other seeds are coming and the other agricultural protocols are coming, now they are competing together. So there's a risk of both of these things, and this sort of experiences is going on where there is some positive things that you can see in a market being graduated, And at the same time, when it's in a work field, they are feeling pressure because there are some categorical institutions who are introducing a more efficient way of production. So at one end, the group of women that has risen up, taking their local practices and production and the flavors, seem to be sometimes seriously challenged because of other production. So this type of ongoing contestation is going on in the field, actually, in a remote area. This is one of a story to share you about in Var, Ronbak, if I spell it correctly, in context of one of the remote areas of Nepal, where approximately I have to work 4 hours from the latest road in the western Nepal, which are very hilly areas of around 9,000 populations in a very wide hilly areas. So things are not easy, but people are taking everything that comes, trying to preserve the local agroecological and the way and the approaches, and also trying to harvest what others are introducing. So because they are taking everything what's coming in, and people educational level is also like not very good. So this is the sort of challenge, dilemma, and the contest that the peoples are living on. Actually, that village population, though the whole country population is rising, the village population is getting down because the whole global phenomena we have been increasing in urban population. So that's even over there. So this is the scenario of contesting, and sometimes we also feel in a dilemma whether we should let them get it into the more efficient approaches, what is shown to them, or they should continue what they have started and then grown up a little bit from. So confusions, things are on actually confusions in part. So just to let you know about, I think it's similar to what you told it in your case. In our cases also it's similar, but the scenarios are a little bit different. It's more hardship here. It might be more easier over there in terms of physical hardship.
Could I just give a short comment? I've seen also these examples in the Homa Bay County alongside Lake Victoria in Kenya, where youth groups have gathered. Some have academic training, some also get some support from the research community, and also working together with vulnerable groups, young women who get pregnant on an early age, and those who have been affected by drug abuse. And they have gathered a group that were now producing food for the local market and diversification. So intelligence, the community work and such thing, all the hardships that they are facing, but it was a beautiful example in the local area where people try to survive and manage with a good spirit. And they also captured everything in a very, very good sort of policy for their own work, for their own group. So it's not only the big policies that are key, it's also the small ones, I think, for the communities themselves. So sorry for saying that.
Okay, great. Thank you for that example.
Yeah. So in the case of, for example, Nigeria, I think there are other interventions that have to do with local farmers from the government, from international organizations like FAO, also other parties that are interested in agriculture, like Agra and rest. But when you look at it, if you dig deeper, you find out that these interventions don't really go to where they are needed. For example, some aspects they work together with government officials, and sometimes before those interventions get to these local communities, maybe it's during the rainy season, while some interventions need to be there before the rainy season. And because of bureaucracy and other things that takes time for these things to get to the farmer, to the real farmer. So you find out that it takes longer than necessary, and it happens all the time. The repercussions are that even when the intervention comes, it will not be as useful as before the farmer starts at the rainy season or the crisis. So in the comment section, there is Good question from Hawa. He said, what role do women-led cooperatives play with security? And back to you.
I love this. This is such a good question, and it's transformational. There are so many great examples of cooperatives, especially women-run cooperatives, being able to aggregate and better negotiate with buyers, taking out some of the middlemen that can, impede profit margins for the farmers, and be able to make also do great natural resource management in communities. So extremely important. And that's one of the things I think when we talk about food sovereignty, it's how do we organize at local levels so that farmers can have a stronger voice, and you can do that collectively. If you're only producing, a couple of quintales in the Spanish word, but aggregating that and being able to negotiate better with buyers can make a huge difference in the price that you get. And it also can help share better practices. CARE has this effort we call Farmer Field and Business Schools, where we put sort of women farmers at the center of educating and training, but also collaborating to make sure they can connect to businesses, but also when we can do that in a way that puts the farmer in a place of power in negotiating, can make a huge difference in income for farmers. So love that question. Over.
Any comment, question? Any comment, question?
Yes, there's a question.
Okay, yeah, sorry.
My name is Aruna Yusuf. I work for the center here. Now, my question is, beyond 2030, what bold shifts can we implement that we see that food crisis goes beyond climate crisis in the global south? And like the speakers have stated, adaptation mitigation policies are being implemented for vulnerable communities. My question is this: how can we help vulnerable communities to go beyond being beneficiary to be part of the policy and decision making in order to see how this food crisis will be contained? Thank you.
Oh my goodness, great question, because it's not beneficiaries, they're partners, right? It is the communities that should also be in the driver's seat in leading in this. So I think some of it comes from a mentality shift to make sure that, and this tool I referenced earlier, the CVCA, the empowering communities to know both what their vulnerabilities are to things like climate change or other shocks, and also what capacities that they have or need to be able to be strong and be able to face more extreme heat and more extreme weather. I think information is really power. So making sure and being able to have empowering through both information and leadership, and especially putting, I would say, women and youth in leadership positions, is the first and best way to make sure we're having the sort of inclusive change and food system transformation we're talking about. But even changing that mind shift from beneficiary to partner, I think is really important. So you're asking the right questions, and that government, and that we hold government and engage government as account too, because we have power as citizens and through our advocacy also, and how important local government can be to help get the right policies in place too. But yeah, you're asking the right question. Oh my goodness, there's so many good questions, including in the chat now too. Eco, I think your question on inclusive transformation helps smallholder farmers adapt to climate change. I think what we've seen is if we're not being inclusive, we're not looking at who is not having both power and the power dynamics, we're not going to have equitable climate change. There's really interesting studies that have been done, and just seeing even in cities, if you look at where you live, some of the poorest areas of cities can be most impacted by flooding, for example. So, you have folks who live in unzoned areas and are in non-registered housing. Sorry. Those are where there's more mudslides. It's people, the poorest can live in some of the most vulnerable areas. So if we really want to reach our SDG goals and have inclusive development, we need to take from the beginning, where are people vulnerable? And put that front, and that's one of the first questions that you ask is like, who's vulnerable? What are you vulnerable to? And then how do we address some of those issues, recognizing also and getting that information that, oh my goodness, you know, it's getting hotter. So pregnant women are more at risk because of preeclampsia and different extreme heat and different. So looking at risks, but looking at who is at risk. Because if you can just turn on an air conditioner, you're not as at risk as a family or a woman who does not have access to that, obviously. So how do we think about what those challenges are for everyone, not just those that can afford the ability to adapt? So sorry, long-winded answer. It's a very good question. But if we're not doing it right, we are failing miserably. So really putting inclusion and looking at vulnerabilities is a huge key component of the work that we all need to do.
So there is another question saying, how can NGOs and community-based organizations really get funding from private companies or institutes? What strategies or way do you propose?
Really good question, because it's really easy to say, oh, work with the private sector, and that's been, people have been talking about that development on and off for the last 20 years. So part of it is finding companies that I think have the same mission and value that you as an NGO do, and they may just be there, may have a profit-driven motive to some of it too, but looking for those companies and also showing like, hey, we as an NGO, what we bring to the table as an NGO and why a company might be interested in partnering with us. So if a company has a supply chain and are working in, I don't know, chocolate, cocoa, you're trying to put solar energy in that area where there's a supply chain, you can talk to that company about, hey, this will, if these farmers are in your supply chain, you've said and made these strong commitments about reducing emissions, we're putting solar in this area, let's partner together. Because if you support us and engage with us, we can talk about how you're reducing what's called your scope 3 emissions. And again, looking at the carbon footprints a lot, as a lot of companies have made some really good commitments on reducing emissions, but then they have to do it. And a lot of the local organizations are on the ground doing the actual work. So sort of thinking about those connections is one way to approach some partnerships specifically in the climate, and just thinking very much about the solar space that you all work in.
And Joshua, I think Joshua should be last because we're almost more than an hour. So Joshua is saying, how can farmers in Africa, Asia, have sovereignty over the seeds and the soil food?
Oh man, that's a good question.
It is.
There is a lot. I mean, there is so much. The seed systems in many countries in Africa. How do we get seeds that are drought tolerant, and all of the different seeds that can feed families and thrive, and also a lot of the indigenous seeds. There was a really interesting effort called VAX, a Vision for Adaptive Crops and Soils, that was looking at how do we get more indigenous seeds that have the right traits to survive climate change, was really being pushed. So I think thinking about what the demand is locally, and then working and engaging with the very elaborate, often seed systems and seed sector is one way. But I'm going to drive you to school. Sorry, is a very challenging. And sorry, sorry.
So
I'm having morning getting to the bus stop issues here.
No,
I'm not answering this question well because it's a very challenging one, and I would love to hear your thoughts on what you.
But you have really give it a good shot. So the final thought, your final thought. Just your one piece of advice for the next generation of climate leaders.
Well, as I have future generations coming in and saying hello, I think apologies for the interruptions. I think that actually dovetails with my final thoughts on this, is that the world is changing very rapidly. Climate is making our lives harder for those of us that are working and care about inclusive development and food systems that can feed ourselves and our future. And if we don't act now, I think with urgency, to both work at a community level and then also advocate for changes that will make food systems more sustainable, we are setting ourselves up for a much more challenging future for the next generation. I think, though, there's so much ingenuity and expertise and energy in the world on this call, on this Zoom call and webinar, that want to make a difference and change, that I feel a lot of hope that we can make these tough choices and tough challenges and work really hard to have a more equitable food system right in the near future and well into the future for the next generation. And I just really appreciate the invite to get to talk to you today and hear about the work that you're doing and the really fun and good questions. So thank you all for your time and energy.
So just 1 minute for the last time, and everyone on his camera so that we can have a quick selfie. On your cameras, good. On your cameras, so we can have a quick selfie and call it a day. Yes, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you for on your camera. Yes, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Yes, this is nice. Okay, so let's say 1, 2, 3. There you go.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you so much for your time.
Thanks. Bye.
You're really good. Bye.